we're actually going to talk about something that David Cameron thinks has failed. Nick Clegg thinks it's very important. I'm not talking about AV in this case, I'm talking about the case of multiculturalism. Now, our guest of the day here, Douglas Murray, thinks that David Cameron is in fact right. Here's his take on the issue.
David Cameron says that multiculturalism has failed. I'd go further than that. I'd say it's been the most pernicious, divisive policy pursued by Western governments since World War II. It's a deeply misunderstood idea, but multiculturalism is not the same as multiracialism or pluralism. Nevertheless, for years, anyone who has criticized multiculturalism has been described as a racist. State-sponsored multiculturalism judged that the state should not impose values or expectations on immigrants. Rather, it should bend over backwards to accommodate the demands of immigrants. The multicultural era would have continued a lot longer if it hadn't been for radical Islam. But the fact is that Western societies have now nurtured more than one generation of immigrants who not only appear to feel no loyalty to the country they're in, but actively, in some cases, seem to despise it. The question now is what can be done about that. I believe that from school age upwards we have to reassert a common British narrative, a core culture. But the Muslim communities that David Cameron talked about will not reform themselves. The government is going to have to shut down and prosecute any organisations, including charities, that are linked to extremism and terrorism. Preachers and others who come from abroad to preach hatred and division should be prosecuted and deported. So will Mr. Cameron be able to do any of this? Well, his talk of a new muscular liberalism is certainly to be welcomed, but there are good reasons to be sceptical. In 2005, after the London bus and tube bombings, the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, said that the rules of the game were going to change. And the thing is, they didn't.
And the author of that little narrative, Douglas, is still with us. And we've been joined by the political editor of the New Statesman, Mehdi, Hasan. You two have crossed swords on this issue before.
Have we?
Publicly, hotly. The thing is, the rhetoric is heated. Let me just throw some of it at you immediately, Mehdi. So Douglas says, discussing multiculturalism, it means that if you were a white English girl born into a white English family and your family decided to marry you against your will to a randy old pervert, the state would intervene. But if you had the misfortune to be born into an Asian background family and the same happened, the state would look the other way. Is he not even allowed to say those things?
Of course he is. Who said he wasn't? I mean, there's a lot of straw men in this debate. No one says Douglas is not allowed to express his view. In fact, the dominant narrative right now is anti-multiculturalism. In fact, I'm the minority in a different sense, not Douglas in terms of the debate. And of course, no one says it's racist to be opposed to multiculturalism. Of course not. What I would say on that specific issue that you raise, for example, forced marriages, is it's just not true. The state doesn't look the other way. The Foreign Office and the Home Office have a unit that goes out to Pakistan to rescue British girls who've been sent out there. And no supporter of multiculturalism, and I would count myself as one, defends forced marriages on multicultural grounds. So it's the whole thing is a straw man argument.
And that is an accusation levelled at many of those who argue from your standpoint that you paint with far too broad a brush. For example, you talk about immigrants despising the country they live in. How many immigrants despise the country they live in?
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be a very large percentage for it to cause huge problems, as we learned in 2005, to our great cost. First of all, I don't agree there's this...
They weren't immigrants.
No. I'm saying people who come to this country and who are then taught and acquire a sense of hatred towards this country. First, I mean, what we're seeing in Britain is a form of reverse assimilation. People are less integrated in this generation than their parents and grandparents because there is less desire and to actually get involved in the country they're in. And another thing, this isn't a straw man argument about the forced marriage issue because, yes, it's true the FCO has now got a forced marriage unit. It was very late in coming. And the phenomenon of girls of Asian background being married off had been going on for decades until government got involved.
No one's denying that, but it wasn't going on because of multiculturalism.
I don't want to get hung up on forced marriages, because we could talk about... We're talking about the broader aspect of multiculturalism.
But Douglas is just wrong to say that a younger generation is not as integrated.
But you can't have it both ways, because on the one hand, you have said yourself that it alienates, particularly the British Muslim community, when people paint in the brushstrokes that Douglas is using. So you talk about the alienation, yet when he talks about the alienation, you say it's not true.
That's apples and oranges is different. I mean, I'm talking about alienation that we're creating right now. I'm not talking about the last 40 years, of which Douglas is basically indicting 40 years of integration
but where
of
are
immigrants.
we now? Where are we now, do you think?
Where
are we now?
Well, let me just take one poll, to bring some facts into the debate. In 2009, Gallup did extensive polling of Muslim communities across Europe. They found that British Muslims were more likely to identify with Britain than non-Muslim Britain, 77% to 50%. They found that British Muslims were more keen on living in mixed areas than segregated areas than non-Muslim Britain, 68% to 57%. So I don't buy this caricature from the right, which says all young Muslims are out to blow stuff up and don't like living here.
And it was
not
very
me,
interesting.
not anyone I know, none of my friends.
Andrew raised a very interesting point. I mean, you were describing the bombers as immigrants. At what point do people cease to be immigrants in this country and become, in your mind, national or British or part of the landscape?
As a friend of mine who immigrated here himself says, the point where you become British is the period where you realise you don't get any extra rights than anyone else, any extra sensitivities than anyone else, any extra inducements than anyone else.
You get respect for your culture, Douglas.
All you get is to put up with the same crap the rest of us get to put up with. That's the deal. No extra things. And the thing is that at the moment, the dominant narrative of British life has become lost. And this is what I was trying to say in the film, is that everyone can, as it were, argue their rights, their background, their culture, other than British rights, British culture, British norms. I think it makes it a lot easier to integrate people if you know what you're integrating into.
You imply there's a difference between British culture and kind of minority rights. They're not. No. It's all one and the same thing. We come together.
But sometimes they run very much...
Britishness tend to joust frequently, but I'm very keen to just unpick some of it. At the last election, even the Labour Party held up their hands and they said, you know what, we made white working class people feel alienated, we drove them, we herded them into the hands of extremists.
Well, as we know, the Labour Party could be wrong on a lot of things.
So they were wrong about that?
Well, one of the people who was saying that, of course, was then disqualified from his seat for race-baiting in Oldham. So I'm not going to take lessons from Phil Willis on what integration looks like. But just on the specific point of terrorism...
the message, I want to know about the message. You think that message was wrong?
I think there is an issue with working class communities, white working class community insecurity. I think that's an economic issue. To pretend it's about language or forced marriages or these issues is rubbish. And I've got to address this terrorism point. Sorry, the 7/7 bombers. Very briefly, you've had a long film. The 7/7 bombers, let me just make a very specific point, could speak English, married of their own accord, played cricket. They were not in forced marriages or...
I have to let Douglas Murray have a final word on this.
This is the tragedy, is that there are people in this country who do not feel loyalty to this country, who do not feel they have to have any loyalty to this country. And we saw there one of the end points it can reach.
All right, gents, I have to call time on this. Very fascinating and something I know we'll come back to. Thank you, Mehdi, for coming in. Thank you.